And there are several other cannabinoid molecules that are worth knowing, and I'll definitely be testing these if you are taking an exam in my class. First and foremost, cannabidiol, which used to be believed that it was derived from THC as the plant matures. Those data are disputed now. I don't need you to know that. But what we are seeing is it may only be active at moderate doses. And again, there's a lot of debate on this. The anxiolytic effects in particular, at least acutely, don't kick in until like 300 milligrams, at least on the published data, but other folks really swear by just having 30 milligrams a day. I haven't seen good placebo-controlled work, and I want to be mindful of that. Cannabidiol itself has an intriguing antipsychotic effect, and some researchers in Germany have added it at up to 800 milligrams per day for some folks as an adjunct to their regular antipsychotic meds. In contrast to, say, Marinol, which a high dose of Marinol, which is just pure THC dissolved in sesame oil, suspended basically, is going to be really, really potentially haunting and have a lot of psychotic features, increased magical ideation, some delusional thinking. It's a frightening thing to experience. And if you see somebody take those 10 milligram Marinol and they're not prepared for it, it is not a good idea at all. The anti-seizure properties have been confirmed now. Dr. Warren Davinsky down at NYU has shown, particularly for children who had often dozens, if not 100 seizures in a day, can at high doses of cannabidiol basically drop those to just a couple. And then soporific effects, the CBD-induced challenges to insomnia. Basically, there is a relaxation effect. It looks like it's biphasic, so that you have to take CBD at least an hour and a half before bed. There's a mild increase in arousal and then a drop, and want to just time that so you end up in bed on time. All right, I'm a little scared about the size of the file here, so I'm going to go ahead and store this, and we will pick up with active ingredients on Cannabis History 2. All right, and we're back. Hey, I just wanted to pick up the fact that we're going to get into some of the active ingredients in cannabis again as part of the history, but we're really learning new subjective effects of different cannabinoids. So cannabidiol, again, I had this weird idea that maybe THC becomes cannabidiol. That's really not true. One of the confirmed effects is CBD seems to take some of the magical ideation parts of THC down. So if you've got a high THC strain, that alone is not going to predict subjective effects necessarily. And so it's this entourage, as Ethan Russo gets credit for saying. It's the combination of multiple molecules that seems to contribute to subjective effects. As you can imagine, getting the money to figure all this out, even in industry, has become kind of problematic. The placebo effects of different strains and their differences are also worthy of note, but cannabidiol definitely seems to take away the appetite-enhancing effects, which may or may not be a good thing, and some of the magical ideation or trippy side of it. Nevertheless, we're really in our infancy on this, and there are so many cannabinoids getting identified. It's gonna be a while before we have all this figured out. And then, although there are literally over 100 cannabinoids, one to keep in mind is cannabinol. This is another one that seems to be a key issue. And again, we thought maybe THC degraded to cannabinol during storage. It doesn't seem to actually be the case. So this does bring up the issue about potency. So often hearing, hey, today's marijuana is not what your granddad had in Woodstock. In all honesty, we do have, a strain that was 30% THC recently. It really is stronger than it was back then, but there are also some serious problems with underestimation of what the potency used to be. So everybody's memory is its own issue. We won't rely on self-reports from what folks remember from, say, the 1970s. but we definitely saw measurements of THC at the time were unaware of the fact that THC definitely does degrade over time. So if it was confiscated by law enforcement and kept in some hot evidence locker, and then at the end of the month shipped down to the lab in Mississippi that does this work, of course it's not going to have the same THC as it once did. This does bring up some issues about storage. Obviously, the freezer is not your friend because it's so dehydrating, but a cooler temperature certainly is going to slow down this kind of chemical degradation. CBN's data doesn't look anywhere near as psychoactive as THC. There's a subset of folks who informally are experimenting with it and telling me various things, but it's just so part of the entourage that I'm not sure what to make of CBN by itself. Animal work suggests there's some improvement in immune properties, definitely some sedating effects, but again, it's hard to second guess these. We do see lower temperature. The synergy, again, we only got small samples in humans, but it looks like any THC-induced stimulation is probably going to drop. Subjective effects overall may drop, and the full duration may change, but again, we're really just getting started on this, so not necessarily something that we can rely on yet. Intriguing plant with a lot of contributors. Yes, so this potency issue, I gotta admit, although it's not that cannabis is 100 times stronger than it was in the 1970s, which is the kind of stuff I end up having to dispute often, it's definitely 3 times stronger, right? It's 30% THC was not something we really ever had back then. This is a product of, just ingenuity, crossbreeding, and then, as you can imagine, the resin is part of the plant to keep it away from damage related to heat. So if it's grown in an environment where there is a lot of heat, likely to get more of those resins. THC concentration may correlate, but really the take-home message is we've just got incredible range. So based on confiscated cannabis and work done down in Mississippi, we've had literally 0%. So somebody got burned, or here clearly got only CBD or no THC at all, to 30% THC has been reported, at least in the UK. As I mentioned, this used to be stored in hot evidence lockers. It's really improper if you want to get a good estimate of THC. So when people are saying, oh, it used to be 1% THC and now it's 30%, it's 30 times as big. I assure you, 1% THC is a placebo. It is not going to have any psychoactive effects. In laboratory work, they think they're in the placebo group. It's just not an issue. Now, it does raise the question, is stronger pot a bad thing? It's not a bad thing if you can count to 1, right? So if you're accustomed to a certain dosage and then use that same dosage with a stronger product, then of course it's going to be problematic. You can't drink whiskey like you would drink a beer, but particularly with respiratory irritation as a concern, if you're going to smoke the flower, anything that gets you to smoke less is going to decrease the presence of respiratory irritants. And folks who need to have, rapid relief from, say, nausea and vomiting or something like that, it's going to be very important to get as much in there as quickly as possible. Now, everybody is concerned, though, does this increase some kind of addictive propensity? We'll get into that more, but truth be told, everybody thinks everybody else is more likely to become dependent on it, but we don't have any data suggesting the high concentration necessarily does much other than enhance the development of tolerance. So again, less is more with this and a whole lot of other things we've discussed. Bottom line is, how high is high? What is the subjective effect, or what is the medicinal effect folks are looking for? If we're attentive to that, things are going to go better. And so, as I've mentioned in my lab, we've shown that people who are savoring, people who pay attention to subjective experience and relish it, shall we say, they're less likely to develop cannabis-related problems, even if they do smoke frequently or at high amounts. So, by all means, be a little mindful if you're around the plant or even if you're not. And then a curious lesson in the different preparations, just I want to emphasize that at least in India and some Middle East, we have BHANG, which is sort of like a lassi, like if you ever had mango lassi at an Indian restaurant. BHANG recipes, I actually have a have my student Archana's recipe for bhang. I'll show it to you guys coming down. Charis, basically just the glands, so sort of like a high potency, a higher potency product that's really all bud. It doesn't have stray leaves and stems and things like that. And then hashish, which was a whole other set of legends. But basically, if you shake the plant, those glands fall off, and those can be pressed together into something that's going to be easier to transport, less likely to get moldy, things like that. So the invention of hashish was in an effort to do that. And then those were often the source of medicinal products that we had in the United States in the 1700s. Hash oil, again, another extraction method. What we're seeing really is dramatic range and potency, and as things are more processed, we don't have the data, but we certainly are suspicious that its potential for negative consequences is just kind of unknown. But understanding that we've had this around for so long is important. Let's take a look of the history of cannabis as an intoxicant, sort of independent of the industrial hemp and medicinal uses. So I do want to give Sheneng credit, not that he ever even really existed, but that there were definitely warnings on medical use that back then they said, I think the quote is, watch your dosage or you're going to see evil spirits, which I find particularly intriguing, in my friends who are in the Santa Maria world definitely would agree, I think. The Hindu deity Shiva is mentioned in the Veda. As I understand it, at least, Shiva was struggling with something, ended up meditating underneath a plant, and found the plant and consumed it, and found it such an incredible relief. And so when folks are using cannabis, they are essentially using it as a sacrament in their worship of the god Shiva. You know, religion and drugs, you can imagine how much trouble I get into this, but my buddy Chris Bennett has really done a lot of work on this, looked at how religious use of cannabis has contributed to multiple different cultures. If you're at all interested in that, he's definitely the guy to know. So Herodotus, I mentioned before, in the fabric world, he did discuss industrial hemp in his histories, but he also alluded to a funeral ritual that was popular among the Scythians. So he'll say they threw the seeds, really they threw the buds on a big open fire and then had a tent around it and went inside, and you would go in there and basically huff the smoke and then cry and weep and yell. And it sounds kind of like an early wine funeral, but clearly something that again is bordering on the religious, and trying to deal with grief with cannabis is a mixed bag. But at the time, this is what they had, and it was neat to hear Herodotus do this. And this, yes, the Taoists by the year 100. So independent of use in paper, they said this will lead to immortality if you just have the right dosage. They're saying seeds too, but I really do feel like it was probably buds that contain seeds. It's funny how you can go so long without ever seeing a seed anymore, when that used to be a really big deal. So with the intoxicant things in mind, yes, Pope Innocent VIII condemned hemp and witchcraft. Man, basically, if you were a woman and knew anything about medicinal plants, the Pope was going to string you up. It was really kind of a sad way to sidestep what could have been some very productive knowledge basis for us with the use of a lot of plant medicines. And this, yes, in 1840, we had the Hashish Club. So Balzac, Baudelaire, those guys, basically these wonderful French writers were really into it. The Tax Act is 1937. I'm going to be perseverating on that year on an exam. And then recreational use in 1990s and medicinal use in the U.S. returns. But some of the more important stories are talking about Napoleon basically sending soldiers down to Africa. They don't really have a lot of alcohol. The guys are bored out of their minds, and then they learned from the natives there that cannabis had these psychoactive properties. Went ahead and brought it back, but oh man, Napoleon was really mad about that. There were all kinds of penalties if you were caught. Moreau, as I mentioned, so Gautier, Baudelaire, Flaubert, Dumas, Balzac, right? And everybody claimed they were just observers, but it sounds like they went every single month to observe, so we'll see. And finally, a first sort of American published work on cannabis was The Hashish Eater by Fitzhugh Ludlow. And you can see this is a play on the opium eater that we saw in uh, British work. But he was basically the first American to publish a book-length, treatise, and this was published in parts as kind of like a travel diary. Ludlow was sort of a travel guide writer, and so this was just exotic stories. Depending upon whom you ask, there's some evidence that he kind of got strung out on it, but I think in part it was a high alcohol concentration version, exaggerated the withdrawal effects. We'll just have to see, but that's intriguing. There was a poem published before this by someone whose last name was Greenleaf, actually, that alluded to cannabis, but this is really the one that gets credit for being the first American publication on cannabis. So yeah, I just did want to emphasize that the distinction between intoxicant and religious uses is something I think we should all kind of be mindful of. But as I mentioned, yes, the ganja is the tops, charis is resin or hash, and bhang is the drink. If you've ever had a tandi, basically that's another name for those same. And I do have, here's a recipe my student Archana Jajodia, as you'd guess, is from India. This was the recipe her grandmother used, and it sounds like they literally gave this to little kids at one time. And I'm guessing maybe they didn't have a whole ounce devoted to something like this. This looks like a rather potent. But if you like those Indian spices, you've got ginger and garam masala here. The rose water would certainly add to the scent, but you've got a whole cup of sugar and 4 cups of warm milk, and then an ounce of cannabis, which I just cannot believe would be an adaptive way to make this recipe at all. Now we've got, thank God, at least in some states, medicinal edible products that are clearly labeled, and again, less is more. Please be careful. And then I do just want to take a minute to dispute this assassin's legend. Every time I talk about history, somebody comes up and says, hey, you gotta know that Hassan ibn Sabah, he was a Hassan, and he came and got people stoned, and then they went off to murder people, and that's how we got the name Assassins. And it's like, wow. First of all, just no. Depending upon which dialect of Middle Eastern language you're in, Hassas actually means to kill. So Hassan means killer. Let's keep that in mind. And I just really want to dispute this because it's got these weird anti-Muslim sentiment. The story got spread around by Marco Polo, and unfortunately, he wasn't necessarily the best source of legends like this either, but he said that Hassan would have folks get recruited to his cult, which actually probably was just a religion like today's religions. You would get this big drink, you would pass out, and then suddenly wake up in this garden of delights with, people who want to rub up against you and be nice to you and things like that. And then you would drink it again and pass out again, and then you'd wake up and it wouldn't be there anymore. And then what he said is, do my bidding, and you get to go back there after you die. Sounds pretty complicated. I'm not sure we're getting all the details, but Marco Polo spread the tale, of course. This is not a substance that contributes to violence. I know there's a subset of alarmist journalists out there pointing out that mentally ill people often, if they have a psychotic disorder and use cannabis, they're more likely to commit aggressive acts. It's just single cases and strange data. And then anytime I see these studies, we'll talk about it more when we get into effect sizes, but they'll, measure cannabis withdrawal in people and notice that they were a little more aggressive on some task where they take points away from somebody or think they're giving people electric shocks, and then they'll measure them 11 times, and then one of the times when they are more aggressive, then they make a big deal out of that. So we're going to really dispute this notion. Sure, someone who is experiencing the acute effects of cannabis is probably not eager to tolerate some of the irritating things that happen in life, but the data linking this to violence are either accounted for better by third variable explanations like economic problems, or they're just a bunch of case studies, a bunch of individual memory bias, confirmatory bias type uh, stories. And so I want to emphasize that, particularly in the laboratory, if you randomly assign folks to get cannabis or placebo and then do something that will irritate them in hopes that they will basically react violently back, if anything, it's the placebo group that ends up being a little bit bigger, and most of those results are null. Taylor did a lot of this work in the 70s. I think partly the placebo group was just so disappointed that they're in the placebo group, but cannabis does not make people aggressive. All right, well, I know that was a lot, but feel free to watch this again and again. I'm definitely open to getting any comments or legends or questions. Just post them right here or email me 420research@gmail.com. That's the number 420research@gmail.com. You guys have my I read the syllabus email address if you're in the class. Thanks so much for tuning in.